All right, thanks everybody for joining. This is episode one of the space series with Angeles Investors. I'm your host, Jorge Pastrana. I am the Orlando City lead for Angeles Investors. I'm also the founder of T.I.A Base, a commercialization firm supporting hardware launches in the medtech, industrial, and aerospace sectors. Before we dive into the conversation, on my part, on behalf of my guests and as investors, just want to acknowledge the situation in Venezuela, the devastating earthquakes and the devastating impact it's having on that community. So those in our analyst community that may be impacted, have friends or family that have been impacted in Venezuela, just want to say our thoughts are with you, and fuerza para el pueblo de Venezuela over the next days and weeks. All right. So why the space series? Why now talking about space? And it really has to do with the momentum, the inflection that we're seeing around the space economy. Starting with the Artemis program, the successful orbit of the moon. Director Isaacson of NASA also mentioned, announced the lunar permanence, right? And probably the biggest news lately is the SpaceX IPO, right? So there's a lot of buzz, a lot going on in the space economy, and a lot of people talking about the industrialization of space or moving on from one-off launches or experiments to maintenance in space, whether that's lower Earth orbits, lunar permanence, and beyond. So that industrialization of space is what we're going to explore in this space series. And I couldn't think about it having a better guest to kick us off for the first episode than Adriana Ocampo Senior, that spent her career inside of Boeing, leading audits of the SLS, ISS, as well as now she's the founder of her own company, T.I.A. She's also the architect of an SBIR strategy that became an Aerospace Industries Association best practice. She's an author, and she's also the Dallas City lead for us investors. So welcome, Adriana, to the Space Series conversation.
Thank you, Jorge. It is really a pleasure for me to be here. And then, we have a family within our own Angeles Investors community. And so when you called and then you told me about this series and the topic, I couldn't say anything but yes, right? And then support you in this initiative. And it's a topic that is close to my heart. So I'm glad to be here and then able to share part of my story of almost 3 decades within Boeing and in the space division primarily. So thank you for the invitation.
No, I appreciate it, Adriana. And actually, and before I continue, I forgot to mention, for those in the audience, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat later on in the conversation. We'll get into a Q&A, and Adriana can answer any questions that you may have. But starting the conversation, Adriana, let's talk about your origin story from Colombia to Boeing. How did you end up in aerospace?
Yeah, so I grew up in Colombia, South America. I'm the only girl within my family. So I have 2 brothers, and my dad has a brother himself, and my uncle has 2 boys. So growing up, I was the only girl. But before I was a Boeing executive, and before I even got to audit a rocket or a space vehicle, I was this girl in Colombia that was watching an engineer at the table, my dad and my mother, Olga Senior. She was the first woman to graduate being a marine zoologist in Colombia. So I had, and both of them were first generation going to school. So my dad, he was an electromechanical engineer, and he actually went to college through a scholarship. And later in his career, he went to lead international projects in Sri Lanka and Saudi Arabia. And so, in my house, I think science was not really a career. I think it was more like the air that we breathed. And also education was so important. Like we were told from a very early age that our responsibility was to do well in school, and going to university and even getting our master's was pretty much expected. So the question was not whether we were going to go to school, but what are you going to go to school for after graduation. So I had these role models in my parents, and I think they have already done the hardest thing, right? And it was walking into the rooms that were probably not built for them. And in the case of my mom being the first female going into biology and then graduating from a career that at the time was not for women, they really refused to shrink. So I don't think I learned this discipline at Boeing. I learned it, on my parents' tables, and Boeing just gave me a bigger problem to solve, I think. So I came to the U.S. To attend college. So when I graduated from high school, I'll tell you a story now that we're going through the World Cup, and how this is so cool to have so many different nations. And for many people here in the U.S., they probably have never left the country, and this is the first time that they're exposed to so many different people from other cultures. So when I was going to high school, the year before I graduated, we had the first exchange student in our school, and I went to an all girl school. So I went to school with the same girls from kindergarten until I graduated from high school. And we had this girl from New Zealand that came as an exchange student, and she didn't speak a word of Spanish when she first came to our school. And I thought it was so cool and so bold and courageous of her to come to a country that was on the other side of the globe, that spoke a totally different language with very different culture, and she saw it as an opportunity for growth. And I thought it was just so cool seeing her transition during that year that she was with us, and then she was fully bilingual by the end of that year. But I thought, you know what, if I have an opportunity, I want to go to another country that speaks a different language, has a different culture than mine. And so I expressed that to my parents, and it was through the Rotary Club in Colombia that I got to go to Canada for 1 year after my graduation from high school as an exchange student. And I went to a little tiny town in British Columbia called Dawson Creek, like the TV show. And so I came from the third largest city in Colombia, 3 million people, to a small town population 7,000, right? So I'm in north of British Columbia. So I saw snow for the first time that year. So anyway, so I had, after that year, I actually wanted to stay and live in Canada, and I started looking at universities that had industrial engineering. I already knew before graduating from high school that I wanted to be an engineer, and we had universities that came to our school to tell us about the different careers that they offer. And when one of these universities was presenting the different engineering fields that they had, so mechanical, electrical, civil, and industrial. And based on what I had experienced at that age, I saw that industrial engineering was probably the one that, from the engineers that feel that align more with my desires than what I had passionate for. So I already knew I wanted to be an industrial engineer. So when I was in Canada, I started looking at universities, and I found that there was one in British Columbia that had a pretty strong IE program. But after being gone for a year, my parents said, no, that was not the plan. That's not what we agreed to. You've been gone a year, so we have already registered you for the university, the local university in Barranquilla, that offer IE. So I was in a way forced to go back to Colombia. I'm gonna say forced, but because I really wanted to stay in Canada at that time. Anyway, so I started my engineering degree at the Universidad del Norte in Barranquilla, Colombia. And I found out then that they had an exchange program. So I was stepping into my second year of college, and I found out about this program. And so I came to my mom first, and she said, Adriana, and this resonated with me. So this is why I'm sharing this story with you all, because my mom said, Adriana, I'll support you, right? But do the homework and make sure that when you come to your dad, you have the answer for the questions that he is going to ask you, so that he knows that you're really interested and determined about this move. And it's not like a flavor of the month, right? Not this teenager that doesn't have a plan in mind. So that stick, in my mind, because I think in the past, whenever I presented projects to my dad, I didn't have all the answers to the questions. And not to say that you need to be the person to always have the answers,
Hmm.
but do your homework and educate yourself so that you can come with a proposal that is solid. And so I did all of that, and then my dad asked the questions. I had all the answers. I've done the tests that I needed to take. I've sent all my applications to the different universities, and it was the University of Missouri at the end, the one that I ended up selecting. And my dad said, so what do I need to do? And I said, well, I just need your permission because classes start in January, and this was October. So I'm like, I just need to tell them whether I'm gonna be attending or not. So the that's how I ended up here in the U.S. first. It was attending college at the University of Missouri, and the plan was for me to only come for one semester. So that's the exchange program that the universities had. But I tell you, Jorge, once I put my foot on that campus, I really felt that was my tribe. That was the place where I wanted to be. So I talked to my parents, and it was through really hard work from them that I was able to accomplish this dream to actually stay and finish my degree here. And years later, I became the first Hispanic to be inducted into the College of Engineering Hall of Fame. And and I say this very proudly, but also knowing that, I think we were a little late. And then when you have an opportunity to be in those tables, then make sure that your voice is heard, and that it's not only about you, it's not about the recognition, but what can you do with that? What kind of
Hmm.
impact can you create? And what doors can you open for other folks, right? So look at the processes, look at the policy, and see what we can do to diversify that representation when it comes to those kind of recognitions.
Yeah, and that deserves definitely a round of applause. First Hispanic inducted into the University of Missouri ISC Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Adriana. And I think similar, or I think people in our audience, familiar patterns, right? We hear in your origin stories, right? Inspired by what you saw, your parents doing, and finding a way to accomplish your goals, right? And I think, you mentioned your mother first in biology. I think program you mentioned, kind of like a pioneer, and that definitely
Mhm.
influenced you as well. And that immigration story. So talking about your journey, University of Missouri, Hall of Fame, talk to me about, when you walked into Boeing, maybe, but did you have anything different to prove than other peers, or how did you feel, going into Boeing in your career?
Yeah, many folks ask me, Jorge, so how did it feel to be the first Latina? And I said, in the late 90s, corporate America wasn't talking diversity in the terms that we're talking diversity today. And so Boeing chose me, I would say, because they called me. I'd sent my resume to many different organizations, and I was in Colombia actually visiting my family after graduation. And I'm going to date myself, but I remember receiving a beeper. So a lot of the newer generation don't know
Yeah.
what that is, but it's before we even had cell phones, right? And so my mom sent me this beep to say, hey, you got a call from the Boeing company in the United States, and they want to talk to you. So I told them to call you back. You need to get back home. And so they called me, and they asked me when I was coming back to the U.S. and when I was available to come for an interview. And so it was 3 months after graduation that I had an opportunity then to come and work for the Boeing company. But something I want to share too for those who are on the phone, when before I graduated, I was the only one in my class. We had a small class in the IE program. IE stands for Industrial Engineering. So we had a lot of students that came from Asia. So they came to school, they went back home after
Mhm.
graduation, and then there were my American friends, and then I'm also American, South American, right? So I hang out with the American folks. So all of my colleagues or the people in my class, my classmates, they had an opportunity. Many of them had an opportunity to work while we were going to college, so they were getting that experience. And then they had already accepted jobs before graduation. And at the time, I was here with the student visa, so I couldn't work outside of the university. I ended up getting two jobs that I did within the school, but not outside of the university. And I thought, oh my God, I thought I was in a disadvantage because of that situation. And I'm sharing this because it ended up becoming an advantage for me, because in Missouri, you have a lot of companies that had the headquarters there, right? So you had Emerson, you had Anheuser-Busch, you had Energizer, you had the Boeing company. At the time, it was McDonnell Douglas. So they were looking at the University of Missouri to provide, we were the pipeline of engineers graduating, and the university worked very closely with the different industries to ensure that we were educated to be ready to work, or to have the skills that were needed by those different companies. And so when the companies came looking for students and for new engineers, new college grads, everyone had already accepted the offer. And so I ended up receiving four different offers, right? And so I remember graduating and my advisor telling me, Adriana, you're going to be okay. Just be patient, but I assure you, you're going to be okay. So I'm sharing this with you because, my mom always tells me too that it's in God's time, that I have to be patient, that things don't need to happen exactly when I want. And so what I thought was a disadvantage for me ended up being an advantage. And I got plenty of stories to tell you that that can support that. But anyway, so I got that call and I started working for McDonnell Douglas in March of 1997. And I started in the Midwest, so in St. Louis, Missouri, on the shop floor. So in St. Louis, and what became the Boeing company after that, the center is space and military defense and space. So, and St. Louis was the headquarters for our defense and space business unit for a long time before moving it to the East Coast. But anyhow, so I was the only female engineer on the shop floor. But to me, I guess because I grew up and that's what I told you the story about my brothers and my cousins. I was used to being around men, so to me, it wasn't. It was a differentiator, but I didn't feel different because also going to school, the majority of the person, the people in my class, my classmates were men, and so I think I grew up being around men a lot, and many times being the only woman. So, but what I learned, I think it was, was I intimidated? Yes. The first day of work, I remember coming, all dressed up. My mom had bought me all these professional clothes for me to wear. And then I was told, well, you cannot go to the shop floor wearing heels or a skirt. So tomorrow, pants and closed-toe shoes. And so I couldn't go to the shop floor on day one. Waited day two, I dressed properly. And then I was told by one of the mechanics to go back to where I came from. And he did not mean Colombia. He meant back to my office with air conditioning and all of that, right? And so my dad, I think, taught me something very important. I called my dad and I said, I don't think I'm going to fit here. They just sent me back to my office. I'm the only, I'm the youngest on my team. I'm the only woman on the shop floor. And he said, Adriana, they're paying you to learn. So you're very lucky to be working for a company that is the largest aerospace company in the world at the time, right? And working these technologies that they're using for defense aircraft. Go back to the floor and tell the mechanic that you're there to learn from him, and then to start applying what you learned at school, but for his benefit. So be very humble. These folks have been there for 30, 40 years. You need to learn from them. And that totally changed the tone of the conversation, Jorge. And, I ended up having, like 40 godfathers and mentors and teachers But yeah, so it took a little bit of time, but I think I needed to prove, regardless of my gender or my heritage, that I was part of the team, that I wasn't there to compete with them, that I was humble, that I was respectful, and then I was there to absorb a lot of knowledge and learn from them, and then be valuable. I think that's important part too, is what are you bringing to the table, right? And then don't be afraid to speak up when you see something that could be improved.
No, I appreciate it, Adriana. Pioneer on two sides, first female, first Latina, right, on the shop floor. And something that's coming
Yeah.
through your stories is strength from family, right? The importance of family, the importance of support. Um, and then, you speak about being the first on the shop floor. So you earned your engineering stripes on the shop floor at Boeing, and it informs everything you're doing today, and your career at Boeing. So, let's talk about that now. Section that we're calling the Heritage Foundation, and heritage meaning, the aerospace primes like Boeing, and a lot of times, right, we're talking new space, old space, SpaceX, Boeing, in a kind of a false economy that's been built around that. But let's dive into, your experience bridging both, right? Old space, new space, and starting with, you audited programs like SLS and the ISS. What does the discipline inside a program like that look like that perhaps, headlines don't capture?
Yeah. So at one point in my career, Boeing tapped me for something that I didn't see coming. So it was called the Audit Leadership Development Program. And here's what it meant. So I got selected from about 250 candidates for a 2-year rotation program inside corporate audit. So this was a rotational leadership program that gives the employees exposure across every Boeing business unit. And then we get to evaluate the most complex processes, risk, internal controls in the company, and reporting those findings straight to our senior leadership at the executive council. So think about what that seat gives you, right? I mean, you're no longer working inside one program or defending one schedule. You are the independent set of eyes that the company needs and sends in to ask all the hard questions everywhere. So I remember, whenever I had to come to a new site, I said, I'm corporate audit, but I'm your friend, right? I mean, I wear the same badge that you do. So most people spend their careers inside one program, but for 2 years, my job was to walk into any one of these programs and ask, where is the risk that you're not really telling anyone about, and we wanna be the organization that helps you mitigate those risks before we have external audit coming in and finding those out before we do. So internal audit is risk management, right? Is making sure that a program has all the right controls in place to catch that problem before it becomes a catastrophe. We examine policies and procedures, and then we ask, like simple questions. Do you have the controls in place that are needed to mitigate this risk? If we find that something is wrong here, will anyone catch it in time, right? And if not, then what can we do about it? Or is the problem going to stay buried until it's very expensive for us to solve? So we didn't really pick those targets at random. The programs that you mentioned were actually selected by the executive council. They identified the programs that needed to be taken a hard look into. So that's how I ended up. And because I had my defense and space background, I had already gotten what's called the security clearance. So that's needed for you to have access to programs that has proprietary information. And so I walked in with that security clearance already. So it gave me also and industrial engineering, right? So the work on the shop floor before corporate audit. I also worked so as an engineer, then operations, and then supplier management. So I brought all that diverse experience, and I had my corporate audit. So my security clearance. And I'm telling you all of these too because education, I think it's never ending, and the more prepared that you are, and the diversity in terms of your knowledge, I think then the better position that you are when opportunities like this, corporate audit opportunity came, and in this particular case, having access to the space program. So two of the things that I was
Adriana, are you with me? Apologies for the. Adriana, are you with me here?
yes.
Okay, I think you're back. So,
Okay.
yeah. No, go ahead and keep and pick up where I think you left off, Adriana. I think it was just like maybe the last 5 seconds.
Yeah, so what I was saying was that, having that diverse background of experience in functions, and then also having the security clearance positions me right to be the right candidate to audit this program. So you mentioned the space launch system, and then I
Mm.
also got to audit our space vehicle program. So this is really the heart of why the popular SpaceX and Boeing headline frustrates me a little bit, because that story is fast versus slow, is new versus old, right? But it really misses the real engineering truth. So when you're auditing a human rated space vehicle, you know, the standard is not speed, right? The standard is, will this keep a human being alive in an
Mhm.
environment that is trying to kill them? So, and that discipline is technical DNA, right? So it is this accumulated rigor that lets you maintain quality and schedule when the cost of failure is alive, right? So, heritage is not slowness. I think heritage is every lesson that is already paid for in failure is written into that standard so that no one has to pay for it twice, right? So, I respect the company deeply. That is exactly why I can tell you where we struggled. So,
Mm.
Boeing had real problems on developmental programs, and a lot of it traces to one shift. So across these programs in the past, the contract model moved from being cost plus, where the government shares the risk, right, to what's called the firm fixed price. So now the contractor carries all of that risk. So under those contracts, you're agreeing to deliver a hard price, and you absorb every overrun yourself. So the numbers were sobering. Think about KC-46 tanker, $4.9 billion contract. And then we had to absorb, I said we, when I was at Boeing, absorbed $7 billion in cost overruns. On the commercial crew space vehicle, the company spent over $1.6 billion of their own money, right? So in 2024, the charges on this fixed price developmental program reached roughly $5 billion. Be, billion with a
Sobering
B,
numbers, sobering numbers.
right? So that's the largest loss ever for the defense unit. So, you know, the, our CEO put it plainly, he said performance on fixed price development is simply not where it needs to be. But anyway, so the budget was tight, right? We saw that pattern that we watched, that I watched from being the auditor, and the space vehicle was delayed, right? So every
Mm.
year the program was rebaselining, and when you reset the plan to a new, more comfortable schedule and a new, more comfortable budget, that sounds responsible, but it's really not, because the baseline you reset every year is not a plan. In a way, I think we were hiding the problem in plain sight, and that's what gave, I think, SpaceX the ability to take the astronauts back to the International Space Station, when at the very beginning Boeing was the company that had won that particular contract, and SpaceX was only going to send cargo, right? So I think that's the lesson, and you just have to have controls in place before you need them, and not after there is failure. Um, tell the truth in your baseline, right? Even when the truth is ugly, because being honest, it's even if you're in the red, I think is worth more than being green in a comfortable way when you're not really facing the problems and then your competitor is right behind you. And if you surface the problems early when they're small and cheap, right, instead
Hmm.
of having to replan around them when they're large and fatal, is going to also, I think, change the history of your organization. So I think that will be my lesson for the founders in the room. And is that, sometimes we're tempted to do that exactly, right? And is to sleep the data quietly, to move our own numbers 6 months to the right and call it the new plan. I would say don't do that. The same discipline that we use with big programs is also going to protect your dollars, and your seat round or your reputation. So the investors are not going to punish any honest problem that is nearly as hard as they punish a problem that we hide.
No, Adriana, sobering numbers, from a budget perspective, and sobering also like your input on the audit, right? These are mission critical systems, especially when it comes to space flight systems. So it's not something you can get wrong, right? You got to get it right the first time and every other time. So I think you have like the Boeing heritage, right? ISS, SLS, and now you're seeing the success Boeing is having with Artemis, and then thinking about Isaacson lunar permanence, right? We're going to have to increase human space flight, right, to accomplish those goals. Maybe from the trajectory you've been on and what you're seeing, what excited you to get into kind of more of the space sector, and what excites you of the trajectory it's on now? So.
Yeah, I think innovation gets the headline, but and then when we were talking about audit, so auditability keeps that mission alive, but the companies that scale the frontier are really the ones that are brave enough to look at their own program the way that an auditor would, and
Hmm.
be honest enough to act on what they see on those problems and do it early enough. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we've been talking about SpaceX, Boeing, or you can put Blue Origin, you can put other aerospace primes in there. But I think when we think about long-term mission success in the space industry, like even like you said, right? SLS was supposed to be the human to the space station, SpaceX more utility. Um, it sounds like you need both, right, to make the next frontier of space successful. Any comments there?
No, yeah, absolutely. Both are needed. But what I was trying to talk about with my example is that you have companies like SpaceX, which,
Hmm.
15, 20 years ago, they were unheard of. And so
Hmm.
Boeing was leading when we talk about space exploration, right? For those who are not so familiar with this program, um, Boeing has been in existence for 100 years, and then we were the designers and working very closely with NASA, on the space vehicle that was used before, right? And so that's why when the United States decided then that we needed a space vehicle and we were going to commercialize the program, um, that Boeing then was going to lead the human uh, mission flights, and then SpaceX at the time not as experienced that they were going to handle the cargo, but because of all the situations that I just explained, we kept delaying and delaying the program, and then and see even what happened when we were finally on the test flight able to take the astronauts to the International Space Station, but they had to wait not 2 weeks but 9 months to return.
Mm.
And so space exploration is fascinating, it's important, but obviously it takes a lot of responsibility. And then we see newcomers coming in, newcomers, from like 20 years ago, right? And now you see, as you mentioned, you have the SpaceX, you got the orbits, and you got all these other programs that are there that are able then to catch up with what Boeing was doing before, and when we
Hmm.
were leaders in a space exploration, right, and being the primary supplier and partner for NASA in the International Space Station.
Yeah,
So you got Blue Origin now, you got many others that are doing amazing things as well.
yeah. No, I appreciate it, Adriana. So you're touching on, lessons learned for founders, small and medium-sized businesses, and maybe we dive deeper in there next. And the section, we call it the Valley of Death, right? And startups, small and medium-sized businesses, the gap from a successful demo to a recurring contract, right? And that period can be scary, and how do you bridge that Valley of Death, right? And in your work with Boeing, right, you established an SBIR strategy that became an AIA best practice. What were found, and before you started T.I.A. and the work that you're doing, what were founders and small businesses getting fundamentally wrong, kind of before you created this strategy?
So, for those in the room, let me take you inside one of the most important programs that almost nobody in the room has probably heard about. So it's called SBIR, that stands for Small Business Innovation Research. This program was established in 1982 and is administered by the SBA, the Small Business Administration Office, and it is funded by 11 participating federal agencies. So think of the heavy hitters, the Department of Defense, NASA, Department of Energy, Health and Human Services, NSF, the National Science Foundation, and many more. So here is how SBIR works. Any federal agency that has what they call extramural research budget over $100 million, they're required by law to set aside 3.2% of that budget for small businesses, right? So for all of us, or the majority of us in this room. So that sounds small, but it's really not, because we're talking $4 billion a year that flows to small American companies through one channel. No equity is given up, and there is no loan for you to repay. So this is non-dilutive funding. So the government is really paying you to solve the hard problems. Just like my dad told me, Adriana, you're being paid to learn. Here the government is paying you to solve the hard problem that needs to be solved. And this is based on the technology roadmap that each one of these agencies have, right? So they think about small, mid, and long-term technology needs. So the program comes in 3 phases. So the phase 1 is what they call the feasibility. So you have to prove that your idea to solve that particular problem works. So you can get up to $325,000 on phase 1 to prove your idea. Then you write a white paper, and then you send it to the agency, and they review it, and they see if it's feasible, that what you're proposing, the result that you're proposing, or it's feasible, let's put it that way. Then the phase 2 is prototyping. So you got funding to build your prototype. And that award goes up to almost $2 million, right? Not to you, but to the different agencies, so they disperse that. And the phase 3 is a commercialization. So now you need to turn this prototype into a real problem at a real scale. And then this is what's called the Valley of Death, because this is the catch that changes everything. The SBIR program does not fund the phase 3, none of it. You have to find a big prime. Let's say if you're working with the Department of Defense, then you want to find the Boeings, the Lockheeds, right, the Raytheons, to support the maturation of your service or the technology that you're using for your service or your product. So just sit with that. So the government is going to pay you to prove, and it pays you to prototype it. Then at the most expensive and the most fragile moment, the federal money stops. So that gap between the prototype of that work and the product, that someone is going to buy, um, it's what's called the valley of death, because not many make it, right? So what we did at Boeing when I was the program manager for SBIR, then what I did was working with each one of the leaders of the different technology verticals within Boeing. And then we looked at our own internal technology roadmap. And then we also looked at our make buy strategy. So make technologies that we're going to make at home, buy this is what we're going to need from someone outside. So whenever the agencies release their topics of SBIR, topics then we looked into them and we said these are the topics of interest to the Boeing company, and I released those to the small business community. And why was this important? Because one, now Boeing had visibility of the topics that the agencies were releasing, and then we also knew which small businesses were interested in developing technologies of interest to Boeing. So from phase one, then we would provide what we call a letter of support. So the small business submits a feasibility study accompanied by a letter of support from the Boeing company that says, I think that the approach that this small business is taking to resolve this problem is very feasible. So having a backup or a big company like a prime, it doesn't have to be Boeing. I'm using Boeing as an example, but any prime or anyone interested in supporting your plan is going to look better in the eyes of the investor, right? Because you're talking to someone that has already invested and they believe in your plan. So we accompanied these small businesses through phase one and phase two, and that also helped Boeing in the back end, because now, when we were ready to budgeting for technology for the next 5 years, then we had these small businesses in our rearview mirror, and we knew that we needed to set aside money for the commercialization phase. So this particular strategy then, as you mentioned, Jorge, got presented into the Aerospace Industry Association, the AIA, and it became a best practice. And so as industry then, other companies in our sector started to, I would say, to mimic the strategy that we initiated at Boeing. And so we wanted to close that gap of the valley of death. So more companies were able to make it to the other side.
I think, Adriana, myself and hopefully the people in the audience are starting really to appreciate the level of expertise that you bring, right? From shop floor, auditing SLS, ISS, now best practice, or created that best practice for SBIR, IR, to help, small and medium-sized businesses bridge that valley of death. So really appreciate your perspective. That appreciation is growing. So Adriana, on T.I.A. and your the work, your consulting work, without needing to go into details or name clients, what do companies typically look like when they come to you, and what do they look like once you've worked with them and they're off implementing or commercializing their products?
Yeah, good question. So what I help the companies mainly is an operational excellence. So it's taking the same rigor, I think, that we followed in a big company like Boeing, but also applying it to the small businesses. So I'll give you an example of one that I'm recently working, and I think excites me a lot because it's aligned with the space work, because not everyone has to be in the aerospace arena. I work with small businesses in all different industries, but this one in particular it's a joint venture. So it's a small company that is doing a joint venture to bring drone technology from India. So the company in India has patents in place. They have 6 different products, so drones, and then this small business wants to Yeah, it's a small business. They want to do a joint venture and then start manufacturing those drones here in the US. When I had the first meeting with them, I asked about the strategic plan, and they look at me like, what are you talking about? So when you have limited resources, you want to make sure that you take the time to strategize, right? And why is this important? Because I keep hearing, we sent this person to this conference, we're investing in this, we're doing that, and I said, and how does that align to your strategic objectives? And taking the time to do a strategic planning, I think is important to big companies to small companies. So we started with that. Also identifying who were the leaders in the particular verticals in these organizations. So who is a good grant writer, who knows about manufacturing, who has experience with drone technology. And in my case, then, being here in North Texas and then having my background in aerospace, there is a community here in Alliance, Texas, that has created a cohort for UAS, right? So for all the unmanned autonomy vehicles. And so you have government that have set aside money to support this cohort. Then you have private, and then you have the presence of the FAA. So this area has really becoming probably the center of excellence for autonomous vehicles. And so what I did then was to propose for this organization on the East Coast to come and connect them with the cohort here in Alliance, Texas, in a very strategic way, so that they knew the people who are running the airport and all the different test flights, the technology that has already been developed here, and SBIR, for instance, as a way of looking for alignment and then to get funding for some of the work that they were doing. So that's the kind of work that I do depending on the need of the small business, and is really understanding where they are, meet them where they are in their journey, and then put a plan in place so that they can get to the next level, but with operational excellence, with I'm a Lean Six Sigma and now AI certified consultant. And so it's bringing all that discipline, I think, to the systems and the processes of the small business as well, so that they can grow with a very solid base.
Yeah. So beyond SBIR, looking at the fundamentals, right? That you have the strategic plan in place, and also being a connector, right?
Yeah.
Putting them in the right places so that they can succeed.
That is correct. And I think that being a member of Angeles, gave us all of that. So it's also tapping into the network that we have within our members, right? Because, yes, we have a lot of investors, but then we also have a lot of founders that are in different places in their career and their journey, right? Some of them, many entrepreneurs, and small businesses, that rank from 5 million, to $100 million and more, right? So tap into this network and then talk to our members, find out what worked for them, what didn't work for them, because if you can just learn from those lessons, then you don't have to pay the price, and then you can expedite your process to get to the next level without having to going through all that pain yourself.
Yeah, no, definitely. A plug for Angeles investors. No, appreciate it, Adriana. And we do have time for a question or two. If anybody in the audience has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. But in the meantime, Adriana and I will continue the conversation. So talking about investment, right, Adriana, and founders, from your seat, your experience, for an investor evaluating potential deep tech hardware company, right? This can be space sector. You just mentioned autonomous drones. What's the single biggest operational red flag you see, or you would recommend that they flag in evaluating a founder or a startup or small business?
For the investors themselves, you mean?
Yes, on the investing side, investor side.
Yeah, I think I want to know, how this particular company, what problem is the one they're solving for, who is our competition? Like it's following kind of like SBIR, right? So what problem are you solving for? Where are you in that? And what is your plan to get to where you want to go? I want to see a solid plan, your projections. I want to understand your projections, and where you are really in your process. So are you in the angel investing phase? Are
Mm.
you on the seed money phase? Are you already on, um, or what are you really, right? So we had a meeting yesterday, actually here in Dallas, with JP Morgan, and then we had a couple funder companies. And so we asked them, what was your journey when you were going through your funding process? And so it started with the family, right? And then it started with an angel investor, and then the co-founder of a company called Michamba, he was telling us how he had his plan in place, so they knew how much money they needed to get to the next level. And he spoke to another founder that was way ahead to where he was and was willing and investing in these companies' technology and what they were doing in WhatsApp, using WhatsApp and actually connecting with the blue collar community. So I think you also need to understand your market really well, right? And what is that gap in the market? What is your niche? And again, the what is your competitive advantage? And what is the problem that you're solving for? And so he had all of these pieces in place, and the founder was willing to introduce him to the investors. And so he said, once you do that homework right, and then you get through the first investors, they all talk to each other. And so as Angeles investors, I might be having a conversation with you, Jorge, where you say, hey, Adriana, so we were presented, these 4 startups. What are your thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
How do you interpret this part of the pitch? And are you interested? And then, I may have not seen something that Jorge saw, but by having that conversation with him, now I'm interested, and I might switch, who I'm going to invest in, right? And so the founders and the not founders, the funders at the bigger level, they also talk to each other, right? And so once one person is willing to invest in, the others go, oh, so if Jorge is investing in T.I.A, in Adriana's company, she's probably doing very well. Let me find out from Jorge. I want to hear more from Adriana. So it's really getting that first funder, I think, to get to know your business, and then for you to be able to answer all the questions. Like when I was in Shark Tank in front of my dad, when I said I want to go to the US and go to school, have all those answers prepared, right? And then back up with data. Data speaks for itself. And then a lot of doors are going to be opening for you.
Yeah. Yeah, it speaks to the importance of building ecosystem, right? Like you're doing in Dallas, building the ecosystem, connecting people, and the importance of groups like I has invested Andrew groups where you're leveraging the expertise of others, right? As you're thinking about these deals, these founders, and these, for example, deep space sectors. So I appreciate that perspective.
One more thing I'm gonna share with you, Jorge, before I forget. So the vice president from JP Morgan that works with the small businesses and the startups, something that she said was, and I'm just using JP Morgan as an example. I don't get paid or sponsored by JP Morgan or anything like that. But they do support Angeles, at the national, the regional, and the local level. But what she mentioned then was, because I said, what word would you give to the small businesses that are here or the startups that are here? So she was talking about the different services that they offer, and it starts from the angel investing portion, and then moving to the seed. And she said, many times they say when we get the first check, we go on and we know where we need to spend, right? Because we've been waiting anxiously for this first batch of funding, and then we expect then when we get to the next level in the funding journey, I would say, then we expect that money to come in quickly when we're looking then for investors. and sometimes the money is not going to come as quick as we think. So what she said yesterday, what Mia shared with us yesterday, then was, after you transition from your angel investing phase, make sure that you contact your particular financial institution, and then you start talking to your banker early, because you're now ready to make the next move, to make the next sale, and you need that money, you need those funds to be in your account in order for you to execute, and they may not come as soon as you think they are. So start that process early when you're transitioning in your funding journey.
Yeah. Now, important to know different sources of capital, different sources of funding, and different sources of support, right? As you're building your business, whether that's a startup or a small to medium-sized business, looking to get into aerospace or defense.
Yeah, and there is grants too, depending on what you do. So so I do the consulting part, but then I'm working on actually on another venture right now that is in, well, I don't want to give out too much, but in sustainability, let's put it that way. And so something that I found out is that there's a lot of grants that have money available for the kind of work that I'm going to be doing. So not only, you can have an angel investor, you can have a bank that is willing to support you, but there's the SBIR that we talked about today, and is not dilutive. And also these grants, you don't have to pay that money back. You just have to show how you're using the money and how those funds are getting you to the operational level where you are actually receiving revenue. And as long as you can prove that, you don't have to return that money back to the organization, right? So it's non-dilutive as well. So think about the many different ways that you can get those funds. It's not necessarily just going to the bank and get a loan. There's other ways as well.
Yeah, understand the ecosystem and those sources before you run to something specific. So I think it's very important, Adriana, that view perspective recommendation that you just provided. So I think I mentioned it halfway, the appreciation for Adriana's expertise that she brought to this conversation, from hands-on at the shop level, coming through Boeing, ISS, SLS, SBIR, best practices strategy, and the work she's doing now, T.I.A. and beyond. And I wanted to say, the future, the frontier, in this case, in the context of the space series or the space economy, is going to be built by those people who understand that heroics don't scale, and Adriana is one of those people, and the importance of having her in this conversation. So again, Adriana, thank you for taking part in the first episode of the space series. In the next episode 2, I'll be joined by a couple of friends who are operators inside the companies doing the space work now, one working on the Artemis program at Boeing, and the other working in Blue Origin. So looking forward to having you all again for episode 2 of the space series, and that's it for episode 1. Thanks again, Adriana, and thanks again anybody who joined us online. Greatly appreciated.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure to be here. So I think the last word that I want to leave everyone with is, remember that the frontier is not won by who launches first. It is won by who can scale with discipline, and that discipline is available to every founder in this room, and it costs you preparation and not capital.
Beautiful. I don't think anybody else could have said it better. So thanks so much, Adriana. And with that, we close episode 1. Thank you all.
Bye.